Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this meeting of Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council's Audit and Governance Committee. A very warm welcome to members of the public, to members of the committee, and indeed to the officers who will be presenting with us this evening. And without further ado, I'll pass over to Mr. Hanton from Democratic Services, who will take us through the housekeeping arrangements for this meeting. Mr. Hanton.
Good evening. Please note that this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee is being recorded by the Council and will be published on the Council's website for a minimum of 6 months. Any councillors or officers not in the room and wishing to speak, please use the raise your hand feature and switch on your video. Please note that there may be some members of this committee who have given apologies for this meeting for reasons such as self-isolation or illness. Although these members may address the meeting remotely at the discretion of the chair, they are not able to vote. And finally, Chairman, please could members also ensure the background noise is kept to a minimum, that mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hanton. Could I ask you now to take us through items 1, 2 and 3 on the agenda, please?
Chairman, we have apologies from Councillor Cox and from Councillor Filer. 2 substitutes have been appointed for this meeting. Councillor Brown has been appointed as a substitute for Councillor Cox and Councillor Dion as a substitute for Councillor Filer. May I ask members if they have any declarations of interest?
There do not appear to be any. Thank you, members. Moving to item 4 on the agenda, confirmation of minutes. The minutes for the meeting held on the 1st of December and the 2nd of December have been circulated. Are you content that they're a true and accurate record of what took place at those meetings? Thank you very much. In that case, I shall sign them for the record. Item 5, public issues. This evening we do have one public issue, which is a question from Mr. Gattrell, a member of the public, which has been circulated. And in the absence of Ms. Zeiss, the answers to the questions will be given by Anthony Harold, who's the interim head of legal and the Deputy Monitoring Officer. Mr. Harold.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, the question to this committee by Mr. Gattrell was, and I'll read it in full so we've got full clarity. Following my notifying emails commencing 25/7/21, including 39/21, copied to CEO, Monitoring, MO, and Section 151 officers and leader, when will the Council resolve the following by? 1. Complying with the Local Authorities Members' Allowances England Regulations 2003 by publishing in the correct format and on the Council's direct search website portals the details of allowances paid to each member for 2019-20 and 2020-21. The Council explains the cause of delay as a broken website link. 2. Complying with the Local Government and Housing Act 1989 and issuing the MO's obligatory explanatory report to all members on this and other similar contraventions. Philip Gattrell, 5 January 22. The response is as follows. Mr. Gattrell, first of all, thank you for your question. The Local Authorities Members' Allowances England Regulations 2003 require the Council to publish the total sum paid to each recipient under the scheme of members' allowances in respect of the basic, special responsibility, dependents, carers, travelling and subsistence and co-optees allowances. BCP Council publishes these notices on its website on the Councillor's webpage. The current notices published on the site are for 2019-20 and 2020-21. The notice for 2021-22 will be published on the same webpage as soon as practicably possible after the financial year end. Following the receipt of the question from Mr. Gattro, officers identified a broken link on the Council's main website. This was clearly unhelpful for users. However, the notices continued to be available from the Councillor's webpage and were readily available on the website, and at all times satisfied the requirements of the regulations. I would like to thank Mr. Gattro for drawing our attention to the broken link, which was resolved on Friday, 7 January. The link from the Council's main website now directs visitors to the page containing the allowances notices. That is the end of the response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I believe that we will be conveying that response also in writing to Mr. Gattro. Moving on to item 6 on the agenda, is the audit progress and sector update from our external auditors, Grant Thornton. And this evening we have with us Pete Barber and Sam Harding from Grant Thornton. Welcome to both of you. And I think, Mr. Barber, you are going to begin with this item. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everybody. Our progress report sets out the position against our 2021 audit, as well as providing, in the second part of our report, a sector update, essentially emerging issues and reports that may be of interest to members of this committee. In terms of progress on the 2021 audit, members of this committee will recall the last meeting in early December. We reported that the audit had not progressed sufficiently for us to be in a position to bring a audit findings report to this committee for consideration. Since that December meeting, good progress has been made on the audit, but there does remain a number of areas of audit focus that we do need to conclude on before we're able to finalise our audit. In terms of those areas of audit focus, they are set out on page 26 of your papers, and essentially are 4 areas. Firstly, property, plant and equipment. I'm conscious that this is an area that we discuss most years at most councils, given its complex nature and significant elements of judgment and estimation. Our detailed work to date on property, plant and equipment valuations has identified a number of issues, and that has necessitated the council going back to its valuers to get further updates and further valuations based on the issues identified. That is in train. Initial indications are that there will be, as a result of the issues identified today, material errors within the draft accounts presented to audit. And obviously what we will do is work with officers once the work's complete in this area to agree what needs to be restated before we conclude our audit. The second area of particular focus is journals, and I think I've highlighted previously that the complex nature of your financial statements and systems has resulted in additional time taken to source the journals and then undertake the detailed testing. We have selected a large sample to test, and that's now been completed. That testing has not identified any journals that are inappropriate, but what it has done has identified a number of journals where the council's authorisation policy for journals has not been adhered to. Essentially, we found a number of cases where officers are essentially posting them and authorising them for all intents and purposes. And as a result of that weakness in controls, we are looking to extend our sample size. And once again, that is in process. and once we've concluded, we will set out the detail regarding this issue in our audit findings report. So those are the main two areas of work to focus on. There are inevitably some other areas that I believe to be of less significance. Payroll, income and expenditure samplings are ongoing, and the other area that will impact on the eventual sign-off is the receipt of the pension liability assurance work that's undertaken by the auditor of Dorset Pension Fund, and we are reliant on receipt of that and analysing their findings before we're able to conclude that disclosure within your financial statements. And we are due now, based on latest comms with the auditor, to receive their report by the end of January. So I suspect that we're now looking with a fair wind at completion in late February, and it would be our intention to bring back the completed audit and the audit findings report to the meeting of this committee on the 17th of March. That's our opinion audit, and as members will know, as your external auditors, our responsibilities are twofold. So we always also have the value for money conclusion work, which is subject to a later sign-off date. Has a target of 3 months following the opinion date. That said, we've made good progress in this area as well. Further progress has been made over the last 6 weeks, and we will be hopeful that the VFM work would follow shortly after the opinion work. Just for completeness, in terms of our responsibilities, on page 27 of our papers, we set out also the current position with regard to certification work. And I can confirm that for all the certification work we undertake, the deadlines have been achieved or are on track. So, Chair, that's all I wanted to say in terms of progress. With your permission, I'll stop there before I cover off the sector update that begins on page 30 of your papers and take any questions on progress with the audit.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Barber. Just before we go into questions from members of the committee, I've listened to your revised timetable, and I'd just like to press you on clarity and confidence of those dates, not least because at a very recent meeting of BCP Council on Tuesday, a member was suggesting that it was the fault of this committee that work hadn't been progressed through the council's processes. But of course that isn't the case. It's because we can't do that until we have that information back from you as our external auditors for the reasons you've set out. Are you confident in those circumstances of the end of February and therefore us being able to bring the report to this committee on the 17th of March, please?
Thank you for the question, Chair. So, I mean, just picking up on that, the observation about fault, just to confirm that it is not, there's no fault at place here in relation to the committee. Clearly, as of today, the audit is not complete, and it's only appropriate for the committee to receive our audit findings report once we are substantially complete, and we're not in that position at the moment. In terms of the timelines that I set out, clearly we are working very closely, as we have done throughout the whole period, with officers at the council. It is a complex audit, particularly in the areas of property, plants and equipment. That is, by definition, as I set out, reliant on receipt from the valuers, your valuers, on the updated valuations, and therefore, to a certain extent, your officers are in their hands. And we are in the hands of your officers and the valuers. So the February target date is predicated on that work being resolved in a timely manner for us to review it, and for that matter, no additional issues or concerns being identified. And that equally applies to the other areas that are ongoing at the moment. And it would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that we are also reliant, as auditors, on the receipt of the pension fund letter of assurance from the auditors of Dorset Pension Fund. And, I've been in contact with them to understand their timelines, and the latest communications from them is the end of January, which would, if that was to be delivered to, provide us with absolutely sufficient assurance time to do the work, subject to that report from them not identifying any concerns that would require additional procedures over and above the default approach. So there is elements of uncertainty in that timeline. I can't give a categoric confirmation that the end of February was deliverable, but we will be working very hard, as we have already, with officers to ensure that the work is done as soon as practically possible and hopefully by February.
Thank you very much indeed. I just as a sort of follow through, as an action, I suppose, perhaps you could send me an email if you think at any stage there will be a further delay, so that I can then inform members of the committee of that delay. I think it's really important with the position that we're in at the moment, suffering a lengthier process than we perhaps are used to, that members of the committee are kept informed, and I think I would very much like to do that if you could facilitate it for us. Thank you very much.
Happy to do that, Chair.
Thank you very much. Questions from members who are present at the meeting? I believe that we have Councillor Cox online. Councillor Cox, are you there?
I am here, yes, thank you.
Did you have a question that you would like to ask?
There's a few actually, if that's okay with your indulgence.
Yes, certainly. How many have you got, do you think?
Oh, about 3 or 4.
I see. Would you like to ask them all, and then I'll ask Mr. Barber to reply to them in that order?
Yeah, sure. Some of them.
Thank you, Councillor Cox.
Yes, sure. Some of them can be taken together, I think. In terms of I think you mentioned a material error in terms of the valuations. Obviously, that's very concerning. And I just wondered, how does that affect the previous year? And if it is a material error that does affect the previous year, is there a prior year adjustment that is required? Also, in terms of the journals authorisation process, that's clearly quite concerning, because actually journals tend to be the source of a significant amount of fraud that goes on. And is the failure to get authorisation this year also a previous year's fault as well? So that was one thing. The other thing was I didn't quite understand why you were still working on payroll work, given that that's a fairly standard area of work, and why that's still outstanding. That was one thing. And then the other thing was just really to understand who is the auditor of the pension scheme, which firm is that?
Thank you, Councillor Cox. Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Chair. With your permission, I'll perhaps hand over to Sam, who I'm sure will be in a much better position than myself to explain some of the detail around those 4 questions. But I will, if possible, add any additional information if it's helpful after Sam's had a chance to respond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barber, and welcome, Ms. Harding.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Cox. The property, plant and equipment issues are unlikely to lead to a prior period adjustment. A lot of them are to do with the change in value of this year, and some issues regarding updating the council's Terrier system, and also just probably some misunderstandings over the nature of the assets due to that handover between the valuers. So none of them at the moment look like they were wrong last year. It was just an issue in the current year with some of the floor areas not being quite right, because as you remember, last year we had issues with the council not having up-to-date floor plans, so they have been measuring some of those and they hadn't got onto the council's system, which was then given, which is what the valuer used to access them. Another one was to do with an asset under construction, which was brought into use this year, which the council hadn't valued when they brought it into use. So obviously that's not a prior period adjustment. So those are the issues that we have, but they are quite, but obviously the council has got some quite large assets, so they would just small changes in things like floor areas do create quite a big difference in the asset value. With the journals, they're really to do with people sort of post, or sort of finance managers asking some of their subordinates to post journals on their behalf and then authorising them. We've looked through all of those journals. None of them raise any kind of concerns with us around the nature of the journals that are being undertaken, because we have picked up some of those journals within our testing. We are extending our testing to do more work on the particular journals that are the responsibility of those finance officers, but there's nothing in there that's alarming to us. It is just a sort of a control weakness. We did pick it up this year mostly just through asking sort of more detailed questions and somebody actually saying that they've done that. As to whether it happened in the previous year, that's still under investigation. But I say we've not identified that it's caused there's anything untoward with any of the journals that we've picked. It's just probably we were reporting it as a control deficiency in our audit findings report, and certainly that's been communicated to management and steps are being taken to explain the process more thoroughly to finance managers and ensuring that doesn't happen again. Payroll has been quite complicated because the council is sort of currently operating 2 payroll systems, but there are other payroll systems for the schools which are done by Dorset Council. We had some difficulties in just getting hold of the reconciliations and just making sure we could work those through, and also with obtaining some of the evidence for sort of contracts that with staff that may have been there for a long time. So I think it's just been a case of getting the evidence really to enable us to complete our testing. And I think the final one on the pensions, so the auditor of Dorset Pension is Deloitte, and they are the auditors of Dorset Council.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Harding. Do you want to come back on anything?
No, thanks. That's very much. If you don't mind, I'd just like to make one comment, because I was a bit concerned about your comment about this committee was being held responsible for the delay. I remember making a comment in the council meeting. I don't know if we were at the same council meeting, but I hope you weren't attributing that to me, because I certainly never implied that this committee was responsible for the delay, although I do remember commenting on it.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Cox. Well, I think from what other members have said to me, there must have been some misunderstanding or misinterpretation of your comments. I didn't name you as the originator of those comments quite intentionally, but I did want to clarify it for the record that we are all clear about how this process is being undertaken and how we're going to conclude it, and hence my further request to Mr Barber, so I can keep all members of this committee properly informed, as I know you'd like me to. Absolutely, and just for the record as well, my comment concerned actually the workload of the committee, and it certainly did never implied that it was the fault of the committee. I was concerned about the workload given other things that were going on in the council meeting. Thank you very much, Councillor Cox, and that workload isn't going to decrease, I fear, but that's mainly because we are reaching into areas which perhaps we should do, and that has necessitated further meetings as a result. And I'm grateful, as I always am, both to members and officers for facilitating that additional work. I think it's worthwhile, and I think it's really what's expected of us to do the job properly. There are no other questions, Mr Barber. Oh, I've just had an indication. I knew that would happen. It always does. Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you, Chair. It follows on in a way from Councillor Cox's first question with regard to the authorisation of the journals, and he made reference to these were areas where there's possibilities of fraud. I know Sam made reference to the fact that they're hoping it will not, and introducing the process where it won't happen again. But in case it did happen again, what are the risks that the council are under and facing should the authorisation be carried out in the way that you have described to us?
Is that a question for Ms Harding, probably, Mr Barber? Are you answering that one, Mr Barber, or is that for Ms Harding?
So I can try and answer that, Chair. So I suppose in terms of risk, clearly, just to reiterate what Sam's comment, that the sampling we've looked at today, and I think we've looked at 99 journals, a number of which were the examples that Sam provided, where a subordinate had been asked to post a journal only for the requester to authorise it. Having looked at those journals, we are comfortable that those are legitimate journals and appropriate. Clearly, the separation of duties is lost, and council guidance is that, for all intents and purposes, the posting and the authorisation should not be done by the same individual. So, as Sam mentioned, action has been taken already to clarify that. Clearly, from a fraudulent point of view, we've not identified, it's very important to state that we've not identified any suggestion of any fraudulent activity whatsoever, but by definition, that control weakness increases the risk of potential fraud should somebody wish to act fraudulently with council monies. But we've not identified anything that would suggest that is happening in practice, but we have quickly spoken with management because we recognise the importance of clarifying and ensuring that that does not continue forthwith. I'm not sure, Councillor, whether that fully answers your question, but I'm happy to try and have another go if you think that I haven't responded to your concerns.
Would you like to come back, Councillor Brooke?
Only to say thank you very much. That does clarify for me, and you've given assurances as well, so I'm satisfied. Thank you, Mr. Barber.
Mr. Stannard, just for the record, Mr. Stannard is the head of the Council's Audit and Management Assurance.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just come in on the point that Pete and Sam have made about liaising with management? So the liaising has been mainly with myself and the chief finance officers in accountancy, and we're internal audit. We're going to be following up some of the specific things that we've put in place through discussions with Grant Thornton on the measures to prevent that happening again this financial year. So we're about to do some of that testing ourselves. And in terms of some of the, if I could articulate one of the risks that we've specifically identified in theory that could happen, and we'll be doing some testing to try and assure ourselves that that hasn't happened, is around accrual journals to and from the balance sheet. Because obviously journals where we're just moving money from one cost centre to another are less risky. Yes, they can distort the accounts, but they're not adding or subtracting expenditure or income to the accounts, whereas the accruals process to and from the balance sheet physically creates a transaction which can, in theory, be reversed in the following financial year. So we're doing some specific testing to make sure that that hasn't taken place.
Thank you, Mr. Stannard. Councillor Rice.
Thank you. On page 37, there is some mention of climate change risk and a good practice guide. And then on page 37, talking about net zero. Just wondering if you could give, I'm new to this committee, so I don't know what the best practice would be in terms of progress that we can do in this area. So I was just wondering whether you have any comments.
Yeah. Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Chair. So I was actually going to come on to this part of the report shortly, but essentially, as I explained in my introduction, this section of the report is a sector update that captures reports from third parties that may be of interest to this committee in discharging your role as those charged with governance. So the particular report that the councillor refers to on page 37 is an NAO report. So it's not a report from us as Grant Thornton. It is an NAO report that may be of interest to you in terms of actually discharging your responsibilities as this committee, given it refers to specifically to audit and risk assurance committees. So it is really for you as a committee to consider whether, one, you're cited on it and whether that necessitates any action on your part, given the context of that report, and for that matter, any other report in this part of our report.
Thank you very much. Do you want to come back, Councillor Rice?
Well, I don't know whether anybody in the committee or any officers have any comments on that. I haven't read that report yet, so I wouldn't be able to make a suggestion now. but I don't know if there'll be opportunities later or.
There will be an item later where I have a comment to make on the area of climate change. So perhaps if we can wait till we get to that place, that might be a more appropriate one for you then to press that a little bit harder if that's what you'd like to do. Mr. Stannard?
Thank you, Chair. Myself and other officers have a role to digest these suggestions from Grant Thornton that come through these sector updates. This is obviously a very new one that's just come out. I'll certainly be reviewing it, and then in my quarterly updates to this committee, it is a potential area that I can bring back some suggestions based on my reading of it, and any pertinent points in that guidance I can bring forward to the committee.
That's all great.
Thank you, that would be very useful. Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Chair. So in terms of the remainder of the report, which is pages 30 all the way through to page 41, as I explained, these set out the emerging issues that may be relevant to the committee, and we've just discussed one such example. Chair, I wasn't planning to go through them, but I suppose the one report that I did want to reference was the Financial Reporting Council report that begins on page 30 of your papers, and just wanted to reference the fact that this report from the Financial Reporting Council does provide details on the latest quality results for Grant Thornton's public sector audit team, of which we are part. So I just wanted to draw out really for the benefit of members that the report highlights what I hope you will agree is a positive direction to travel in terms of the performance of the public sector team, and just to remind and comment that as a sector team, a public sector team, we continue to invest time and effort to ensure that upward trajectory continues. So that was just the only real part of the second part of our report that I wanted to just briefly reference, Chair. But happy to take questions on anything else within the report.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. Members, do you have any other questions of Grant Thornton? No, nobody has indicated, and so I will go to the recommendations, which are simply to ask us to note. Members of the committee, are you happy that we note the report from Grant Thornton? That is agreed. Could I say thank you very much indeed, Mr. Barber and Ms. Harding, for attending this evening, and I look forward to your further report when available. And in the meantime, obviously, as we've agreed, you will send me an email as appropriate about the date when we'll be in a position to consider that report. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you, Chair.
That takes us to item 7 on the agenda, which is the Treasury Management Monitoring Report for the period April to December 2021 and the Treasury Management Strategy for 2022-23. This evening we have Matt Filmer, who's the Acting Assistant Chief Financial Officer, with us online. So I'll pass over to you, Mr. Filmer.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Audit and Governance Committee. So as ever with these Treasury Management updates, we start with an economic update, and the biggest issue that we've seen since our last report is the Bank of England increasing the base rate from 0.1% up to 0.25%, still historically low. The Bank of England cited that inflation was the biggest cause for this increase, and inflation is going to be an issue for the UK and global economies throughout 2022. November's CPI peaked at 5.1%, and the Bank of England are expecting to see up to around 6% in the first quarter of 2022. So this is going to put more pressure on the Bank of England to increase interest rates again. And you'll see in table 1 of the report, this is some projections from the Council's Treasury Management advisors, and they're predicting the next increase to happen around June 2022. So moving on to table 2 of the report, this sets out the forecast Treasury Management performance, which we're currently forecasting an underspend of just under 619,000. Predominantly that's from underspends on interest paid on borrowings. So the council has not taken out any temporary borrowing this financial year, and where we have taken on new long-term borrowing, that's been at historically low rates. The council is also still in receipt of an amount of money from central government in relation to COVID support, and we still haven't had a date in terms of the repayment of that. But because we sat on that money, we can choose to invest it, and we've forecasting an additional 122,000 beyond the council's budget. So table 3 of the report sets out the council's borrowings as at the end of December, which is just over 257 million. The newest loan to update the committee on was £17 million that was taken out in November from the Public Works Loan Board. That's was at a fixed rate of 1.54% for a term of just over 46 years. Moving on to table 4. This sets out the investments held by the council as at the end of December, which totaled just over 168 million, which is fairly significant for this time of year. We'd expect balances to start reducing, but as I said earlier, we're still in receipt of government support for COVID-19 that will need to be repaid at some point. So that's why those balances are at that level. So moving on to the Treasury Management Strategy 22-23, which is Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 to the covering report. So the Treasury Management Strategy is something as a council we have to produce every year, and in accordance with SIPFA's Code of Practice on Treasury Management. And the strategy sets out how we will support capital investment decisions for the council, how the Treasury Management activities operate on a day-to-day basis, and who we choose to invest with, who we choose to borrow from, and certain limits on our activities, such as borrowing. Now, SIPFA actually just recently updated the Code of Practice at the latter part of December 2021. And they allowed a soft introduction of that code. So this 22-23 strategy isn't compliant with that new code, but we have to be fully compliant by 23-24. The changes are fairly limited. It will require some more indicators around debt, which we're already working on at the moment. The biggest change, though, which is effective for all local authorities from December, was the restriction on capital expenditure on commercial investments for yield. As I'm sure the committee are aware, I've mentioned this a number of times in the Treasury Management updates. So this effectively now as an activity is being outlawed. So that's the biggest change that's come from the Code of Practice. Now, one of the predominant prudential indicators within the strategy is around the council's limits on borrowing. And that's set out on page 9 of Appendix 1. It sets out our debt limits. And that table is actually what was presented to Audit and Governance Committee back in July. You may remember we brought a paper to Audit and Governance Committee to increase our limits to support the council's big plan, larger scale investment within housing and regeneration. So that table was reflective of those limits that were approved. And to complement that, Appendix 3 to the report sets out the council's committed capital borrowing plans for the HRA and the General Fund, and to confirm that based on those plans, we were within our limits that we set. However, if we start to see more significant capital investment, we will need to revisit some of those limits that were set back in July. In terms of a couple of other little tweaks in terms of Treasury Management strategy, just to update the committee on, following a discussion with the chair and vice chair of the committee, we're planning to hold a Treasury Management training session within the summer of this year, and that will be carried out by our Treasury Management advisors. We're looking to include within our approved investment bodies, police and fire authorities. So at the moment, we do invest with local authorities. We just want to extend that for police and fire authorities. they offer competitive rates and are still within our risk factors that we take into account with investments. And lastly, the strategy includes an estimate around accounting changes for leases that will see more, effectively see more debt placed onto the balance sheet. So we've allowed that within our indicators and ensured that we've got enough headroom for that accounting change. And lastly, the report seeks approval of an addition to our accounting policies around the capitalisation of interest. What we are seeking is that any capital programme that or capital investment that's in excess of 10 million that lasts over 2 years, that the interest payable on that project we capitalise. At the moment, that would be a cost to the revenue. So effectively, we can capitalise it, add it to the cost of the project. It's fully accounting code compliant. It's just not something that we built into our accounting policy yet. It just allows us further flexibility should we choose to with any future investments. So I'll stop there, Chair, and happily take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Filmer. Members, do you have any questions? Councillor Phipps.
Okay, bear with me on this. This is complicated stuff. So it basically says that our debt headroom, you referred to that, and we agreed this at a previous meeting, I think, is 212 million. Is that right? That's right, it says,
that's the headroom, correct, yeah.
Yeah, okay. But the debt levels on Appendix 3 go up to 288 million. And the borrowing on page 44 is 257 million. I'm a little confused about this. Are we already sort of overshooting the 212 million, or how? Could you just explain it to me, please? Thank you.
I will do, yeah. So on page 9 of Appendix 1, which is the Treasury Management Strategy, it sets out what we refer to as the operational boundary and the authorised limit. So for 22-23, the operational boundary is 855 million. Okay, the actual borrowing that you referred to, that's actual physical debt we've taken on from central government and other financial institutions. We've also got a level of what we refer to as internal borrowing, and this is where it does get technical, but that classes as debt, and we include that on top of that existing debt, and we compare that against the operational boundary. And at the moment, we've still got headroom to allow us to carry on with our plans. Chair, I believe Adam's got his hand up. He may want to come in on that.
I was going to come to him just once I'd made sure that Councillor Phipps had completed her questions.
Yeah, okay. There's obviously a reasonable explanation for this. It's just looking at the paperwork. It just confused me a little, but that's not too difficult. I
would just add, Councillor Phipps, that I'm hopeful that there will be a much better understanding by all members of the committee once we get to the Treasury Management Training Seminar, because that'll be a good opportunity to get under the skin of these issues. And I really appreciate that if you come to them relatively fresh, there's a lot to absorb. I understand that, and that's why we want to do the seminar, so that we're all at the same level of understanding of what Treasury Management's all about.
Okay. I just have one other question.
Yes, certainly, and then I'll bring in Mr. Richins so that he can mop up on that.
This one will probably be quite simple anyway. I just was interested in whether there are benefits of the capitalisation of interest. Obviously, you say it adds to the cost of the project. So, well, it gets added to the project, so therefore the project costs more. But what are the benefits of that capitalisation of interest?
So, do you want to just take that one point, Mr. Filmer, and then I'll come to Mr. Richins?
Yeah, so the benefit of being able to capitalise it, effectively, it removes it as a cost on the revenue account. So it means that it doesn't impact directly on council taxpayers for that year, but it's spread over the next 50 years, should it be a significant fixed asset investment. So it effectively delays that payment over the course of a number of years.
Mr Richards is the Council's Chief Financial Officer. Mr Richards.
Thank you, Chair. And I was just going to come into the previous question, in regards to the previous question, just see if I could potentially just add a little bit of flavour to it and just really just try to emphasise the fact that when Cabinet considered and passed on to audit, and audit committee agreed to the extension of the Council's headroom, what we need to bear in mind is, for example, and that'll be closer to numbers, our current headroom was about 600 million, and we were going to take it up to 812 million as an example. So, it's not, there shouldn't be an expectation that 212 is the total amount of debt the council should get to. It's 212 million on top of the number we previously thought of, which is probably more about the 800 million mark. Hopefully that helps, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr Richards. Are there any other questions? Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. It's not really a question about the content here as such, but it's just a simple request, just wondering whether when we receive these reports, there could be an indication in them of changes from the previous occasion, and especially the strategy. It was mentioned that there are likely to be more changes ahead, and it would be useful to know within the report and help us reading the report to be able to clearly identify changes, so through a highlighting or something like that.
Mr Filmer, that strikes me as being not only a good idea but relatively easy to resolve. Do you agree?
I agree, Chair. We can highlight it on the next iteration of the Treasury Management Strategy, so it's clear to the members of the committee.
Thank you for that. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I wanted to come back to one of the points raised by a colleague a moment ago about the benefits of the capitalisation of interest. This is just, it seems this is quite a significant change in our accounting policy, that's something we've not particularly done before, and with the explanation that in effect, there are some of us who are concerned that there are borrowings for projects and for the big plan, etc., significant borrowings for projects, and the discussion was had on Tuesday night at full council about one of those examples that is effectively spreading the cost of that over the next 50 years to our children and grandchildren and future council taxpayers. And now this change in policy appears to be saying, the interest on that borrowing will be, rather than having to be budgeted for in our annual sort of budget, as it is at the moment. So current council taxpayers, we budget for the payment on that capital. The interest is now being capitalised as well. So those future council taxpayers are going to be having to fund even more, and it just takes the pressure of our current budget and pushes it down the line. And I'm a little bit concerned about that change in policy. So it's really just a little bit more explanation. It might come out in the the training and discussion in the future about the pros and cons of that approach, really.
So, Mr Filmer, could you just take us through the process of the capitalisation of rolled up interest into a specific project and the lifetime of that project? Could you try to identify whether Councillor Brown's fears, which are probably shared by some others as well, are justified, and what measures are being taken to make sure that we're not actually moving the goalposts? Mr Filmer.
Thank you, Chair. It might be worth if I just clarified the policy, because that might alleviate some of the concern. But when we capitalise interest in regards to this policy, it's only the interest for the period of construction. So say we've got a project that lasts 3 years, we will capitalise that interest for that 3-year period, but the interest payable thereafter will hit the revenue account, just like any other interest payable. It just allows during that construction phase for it to be capitalised. So I hope that alleviates some of the concern, just clarifies the policy, Chair.
So from that, I take it means that it is capitalised specifically to that project rather than having an impact on the council's revenue account for that limited period of construction. And so it's accounted for separately and in a different way than historically.
That's correct, Chair.
Councillor Brown, did you want to come back?
No, that helps a bit. That is just a sense that that's just more borrowing. You know, that rather than starting to pay the interest during, let's say, in the example, a 3-year project, rather than our general fund funding the interest in those years, we're avoiding that budget cost, but we're pushing it down the road and increasing even more borrowing. So the borrowing costs of those projects that some of us have been concerned about are going to be even more because we're capitalising the interest during the development phase. So yeah, it's just, I think, another thing for some of us to be concerned about.
I wonder whether either Mr. Filmer or perhaps even Mr. Richards would like to respond to that.
Yeah, Chair, if I can just come in and just say that, you know, for a while now, what the council has been doing is it's been looking at its capital programme and fundamentally refinancing that capital programme by borrowing. And one of the justifications of that was actually ensuring that the cost of a scheme is actually spread over, you know, the life of that asset and the benefit and the period over which the benefit from the assets will be derived. So I think, as Mr. Filmer quite rightly points out, in the construction phase of an asset, nobody's getting any direct benefit from the asset that's being created. But once you've created that asset, you know, its total cost, including that interest, is then spread over the life of the asset and charged across to those people that will actually benefit from it. So it is consistent with the council's overall philosophy and direction of travel on such matters.
I think what might help members of the committee would be if either you or Mr. Filmer could send a note to members of Audit and Governance just to explain that particular aspect of policy, just so that we've got absolute clarity across the committee about what's being said and also what's not being said. Would that help, Councillor Brown, and indeed others? Councillor Rice.
Yes, no, it was just on the same topic. It was for clarification. So it basically we're choosing to pay extra for that facility, sort of in that 3-year period. Am I understanding this correctly? But maybe a briefing note will cover it.
No, that isn't what the officers are saying. I don't know whether either Mr. Richards or Mr. Filmer would like to have another and final stab at explaining that. But as I've said, there will be a note, which I've just asked for, so that everybody can have a really good scrutiny of the wording of that note. Would you like to come back on that item again, please?
Well, maybe just, you know, let's have another go. Let's use an example, and just to, you know, let's assume we're building a housing scheme, and what you would traditionally incur is borrowing to finance the construction, and that borrowing would bear an interest charge. As it previously stood, that interest charge you would start paying during that period of construction. And what we're saying is no. What we want to do is capitalise that interest charge, so it forms part of the overall cost of the project, you know. And then what we do, you know, with that total cost of the project, is spread it over the life of the asset to ensure that we're getting, you know, the benefits in line with, say, if it was a housing scheme, which was a PRS scheme where we're renting it out, with the income that we'd be deriving from that asset, and doing that matching one against the other. Hopefully that might help a little bit more, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richards, and I'm absolutely certain that the Treasury Management Training Seminar will be of even greater benefit, because that's an opportunity not just for members to listen, but to keep asking those questions until everybody is clear and everybody has got to the same level of understanding. I'm not quite sure exactly when we are going to be doing it, but it's sometime later this year, isn't it? Date to be arranged, but I will make sure as soon as I've had that date confirmed that we circulate members so that you can get it in your diaries, because I really would like all members to be available to attend if possible. I think Councillor Cox, who is online, wanted to ask a question. Councillor Cox?
Yeah, it's maybe not necessarily a question. It was on the same subject though. Clearly, the capitalization of interest is quite a long established accounting principle. So I haven't got any particular problem with the principle, except that it tends only to be applied to I've only seen it applied to relatively aggressive private equity type arrangements, whereby somebody's trying to make sure that the losses are not as much as they need to be. And so just because you're allowed to do something doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it. A more prudent approach would be to swallow the interest at the time. So I don't necessarily agree with it in this particular instance, but it is allowed, and it has been done. I'd be interested to know, is it a common practice with local authorities? I know it tends to be done by large building companies, but I've not heard it being done by local authorities. Thank you.
Mr. Richards, would you like to answer Councillor Cox's statement?
Well, I think Matt will be closer to that question than I will, but I think it is something that is undertaken by other local authorities, and as we undertake more activity of this nature, we are always trying to challenge our approach and consider it in regard to how consistent it is with practice elsewhere. And this is something that clearly we've identified there's that opportunity to change our approach in relation to, but I'll pass to Matt to see if he's got anything further to add.
Mr. Filmer.
Thank you, Chair. So there certainly is local authorities that use this policy already for significant capital investments. I think the one thing just to cite is more councils are waking up to this policy because councils are revenue poor, and so this does delay some of that initial cost on the revenue account. So that's why councils are waking up and exploring this policy more. So if that's useful. Thank
you very much. And the final question, I think, is from Councillor Phipps.
Just a quick question. Just going back to Appendix 3. It shows the new in-year borrowing going all the way up to 2027, as far as I can see. Well, those are the headings at the top. Do we have any idea where we started with debt when this council was formed, and then where we're heading? We're obviously heading on an upward trajectory of debt, but have we got any idea where we actually started and what the debt was when we started? Is that figure available, or can it be available as a comparison then to in year where we're going as per Appendix 3?
Councillor Phipps, the figure has been previously made available, but I'll ask Mr. Filmer to answer the question.
It's not here, obviously. No.
Mr. Filmer.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, I don't know the figures offhand. I know quite a few figures, but I don't know that one. But I'm happy to send that round to committee, and perhaps when we have our Treasury Management training, which will be customised for BCP Council, that we show that as a starting position and the trajectory that we're on at the moment.
I think that would be very useful indeed. It would save there being any speculation which isn't necessarily based on the specific facts, and that would help us all to understand the situation better. So if you could put that round for us sometime in the next few days, just to all members of Audit and Governance, that would be appreciated. And the final question on this item, Councillor Brown.
Thank you for your indulgence, Chair. Yeah, I note in the decisions for tonight so this change in accounting policy around the capitalisation of interest is for Audit and Governance Committee to approve that change in accounting policy tonight. Is decision number 4, is that right, if I'm reading the report correctly? Is that for us to decide, or do we recommend it to full council? Because obviously usually the Treasury Management report is part of the budget report in February. But yeah, according to it, it's recommended that Audit and Governance Committee approve this change in accounting policy that's detailed in the report. I'm not convinced that actually I would vote in favour of it at the moment. One of the points I wanted to ask was this change in accounting policy for capitalisation of interest. It talks in there about the financing the big plan, etc., and the explanations that we've been given around spreading the cost of the project over the lifetime of the project. I'm not averse to that. You know, if a major housing development or another scheme is going to last for 50 years or more, then spreading the cost of that over 50 years seems sensible. But in terms of supporting the big plan, does that include the Futures Fund? Because certainly the example we've got of the investment being the borrowing to invest in a scheme for the Futures Fund, and that's been spread over 50 or 53 years, the project that was discussed at full council the other night. I'm not convinced that that asset, which we won't own anyway, I'm not convinced that that asset will have a lifetime of that, because it's a complex piece of engineering and has high maintenance costs, and we won't own it and we won't be maintaining it. So in that case, spreading the cost of that project over 50 or 53 years, I think it was, and then, for example, capitalising the interest on that for an asset that we don't own that may not even last that long. I have concerns about that, actually. I don't have concerns about spreading the cost over the lifetime of an asset, but where I don't have a view that the asset might last that lifetime, but we'll be paying debt repayments and interest and debt on interest after the lifetime of that asset, I would have concerns about. So yeah, just to clarify, does this capitalisation of interest apply to the Futures Fund projects as well within the big plan?
Thank you, Councillor Brown. I understand the point you're making. The fundamentals you don't necessarily disagree with. It's about the life expectancy of the completed project and whether that might be less than the cost being spread over a longer period of time. I wonder, Mr. Filmer, is that one for you?
Chair, I believe Mr. Richards has indicated to speak on that one.
Certainly. Sorry if I missed that, Mr. Richards.
Yeah, I think yeah, if I could just come in, Chair. I think Mr. Filmer earlier in the evening, when presenting the report, identified that policy would only be used where the scheme or the project was greater than £10 million. And therefore, I don't think I've seen a scheme in the Futures Fund that is greater than £10 million at this moment in time. So, you know, I think the likelihood of it being adopted regards to Future Funds scheme is low, but I couldn't rule it out.
Thank you very much. And the other question, which I think earlier was asked by Councillor Brown, was concerning the fourth recommendation in front of us this evening, and whether we were the final decision makers on that, or whether we had to refer that decision back to council. It doesn't actually say. I'd like some clarification on it, if at all possible at this stage. And I wonder whether Mr. Harrell could help us on that.
Yes, Chair. I would, in my submission, I would suggest that the Treasury Management report will be going to full council, and therefore my understanding is the remit of the Audit and Governance Committee, the members here, would be to say that they either regard it as they either note it, or they approve or disapprove of that individual policy, but it's within an overall scheme that is going to full council. So my understanding is that it would require to go to full council. I will stand corrected if I'm wrong on that, because I'm not an expert in finance, but that's my understanding. Happy to take further inquiries on that if members wish to do so.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because what it says among the recommendations is that Audit and Governance Committee approves the change. It doesn't refer, as it would usually do, to it being subject to the approval of full council.
Yeah, I mean, without getting too technical, or indeed telling learned members and the chair the role of audit and governance generally, but clearly there's an element of scrutiny here in this committee, and really what we'd be saying is, as a committee, should you approve this, is that it is a reasonable proposal. It's within, if I can use a phrase, a band of reasonable responses to the recommendations that have been made by the financial auditors and professionals, and that can then go forward to full council for ratification. In other words, there's nothing in principle wrong with the policy. There's nothing untoward, I think a phrase was used earlier in another context, with the policy. It's a matter for council then to determine as to whether they wish to approve it, ratify it.
Mr. Richards, I think you indicated you might be able to help us on this.
I'm going to come in and I'm going to talk slowly so that Matt can just jump in front of me if I'm getting it all completely wrong. But normally we take the Treasury Management strategy for 22-23 to full council as part of the budget report. So therefore it forms part of the budget report that go to Cabinet in February and then be referred to full council. With regards to this specific aspect, I think it is for me as Section 151 officer to determine the council's accounting policies, but clearly I engage with this committee looking for guidance and approval and for awareness and transparency around anything that I'm recommending. So in this instance, I think the specific change is something a matter for, if you like, for me as Section 151 officer, working with you as the relevant committee responsible for Treasury Management to determine its appropriateness. But all of it gets wrapped up in that 22-23 strategy that then gets referred on to Cabinet and Council. Does that make any sense, sir?
Yes, it does, Mr. Richins. I think that perhaps note to self that the wording could have been a little bit sharper than is in the recommendations, actually, to reflect that, because that isn't actually what it says. And if nothing else, Audit and Governance does try to be precise where it possibly can. So thank you for that. And I hope that when we get to that recommendation, perhaps we can record in the minutes that the reflection of what it is that you're saying, rather than what it actually says here, because it doesn't. The two are not totally compatible, I don't think. So, members, I would like to move on because we've still got a lot of business to get through this evening, and we've spent a lot of time on these last two items, quite justifiably, but we need to catch up a little bit. Could I take us, please, to the recommendations on the Treasury Management Report? First recommendation is to note the reported activity of the Treasury Management function for the period ended 31st December 2021. Members, are we happy to note? Thank you. Recommendation 2 is to approve the Treasury Management Strategy for 22-23 and the Treasury Management Policy, Practices and Schedules included in Appendix 1 and 2. Members, are we happy to approve those? Great. Thank you very much. The third recommendation is to note the current position on debt levels of the Council set out in Appendix 3. Are we happy to note? And then the fourth is to approve the change in accounting policy surrounding capitalization of interest set out in paragraphs 29 to 31. I wonder, Mr. Richards, in view of what you've just said, could you suggest how that might be better phrased so that fourth recommendation can be put to the committee?
Now you put me on the spot, Chair.
You've done it to me in the past, I seem to recall.
Payback time. So it is recommended the Audit and Governance Committee endorse the recommendation of the Section 151 officer to amend the accounting policy with regards to the capitalisation of interest.
Set out in paragraphs 29 to 31.
Yeah.
So, members, I don't know, with Mr. Hampson, if you could just repeat recommendation 4 as amended by the Section 151 officer.
That the Audit and Governance Committee endorse the recommendation of the Section 151 officer to amend the accounting policy surrounding capitalisation of interest set out in paragraph 29 and 31 of the report.
Thank you. So, members, that's it as amended. I will take this one to a vote. Could all those in favour of that recommendation please indicate? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And those against please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that is agreed by a majority on a vote of 5 to 4. And further to what Mr. Richardson said a moment ago, this will be wrapped up within the Treasury Management report as part of the budget report itself, to be decided by Council in February. So I suspect there may be a bit of debate about that on the night. Thank you very much indeed, members. And thank you very much indeed to Mr. Filmer and to Mr. Richards. And we look forward to working with you on the Treasury Management Training Seminar later in the year. Thank you both very much. So moving on to item 8 on the agenda, risk management and the corporate risk register update. As usual, we have Fiona Manton, who is the Risk and Insurance Manager for BCP Council, who will be presenting the report. And we will have 2 officers online and available on 2 specific aspects of this. First of all, we'll have Matty Rowslett, who is the Director of Customer and Business Delivery, on that part of the report. And secondly, we'll have Nick Perrins, who's the Head of Planning, on that part of the report as well. So what I suggest is that Ms Manton presents the report, and then we'll go to those individual parts of the report. And it's at that stage that I will then weave in some further risk management proposals from myself, which I hope will be supported by the committee, and then we'll go to the recommendations. So, Ms Manton, could you introduce the report, please?
Thank you, Chair, and good evening. This is the usual quarterly update to the committee of the Council's Corporate Risk Register. Members will continue to be aware of the ongoing impact of the pandemic on the activities of the Council, and this is reflected in the Corporate Risk Register, with the impacts being considered in each individual risk update. This recognises the ongoing position and the need for all risks to be considered in both their usual context and any additional and evolving impacts as the Council continues to deliver services in this environment. The report this quarter outlines the changes in risk during the quarter, with the detail being provided in Appendix 1 of the summary, with the summary of the updates in paragraphs 8 to 11 of this report. As in previous reports to this committee, we've included a target risk score for the majority of the risks. This score represents the reconsideration of the net risk score, taking into account any proposed strategies and actions identified to further improve the management of the risk. This supports both risk decision making and provides a measurable position in terms of the risk being managed towards the target score. In terms of updates, I would like to draw your attention to the following. The first update is the confirmation of the removal of risk CR17. This was the risk to reputation of place and council if summer arrangements are not managed. This risk has been de-escalated and is now being considered at a service level. It will, of course, continue to be reviewed, with particular consideration being given to this risk again in advance of the summer arrangements this year. The second matter I'd like to draw to your attention is risk CR14. This is the continuity of public health arrangements and the evolution of outbreak management plans. I mention this risk just simply to reflect that the update is at a point in time, and this particular risk is subject to continuous change and update in accordance with the national position. So it becomes out of date quite quickly. Obviously, we do routinely update it, but I just wanted to reflect on that for the purposes of presenting this report. In relation to risk CR1, which is the failure to respond to needs arising from a changing demography, risk CR2, failure to deliver effective safeguarding arrangements for children and adults, and CR12, failure to achieve appropriate outcomes and quality of service for young people relating to children's services. These were due to be reviewed during the quarter, as they would be every quarter. Unfortunately, this time it wasn't possible before the completion of this report due to the Ofsted inspection that was taking place. Obviously, we will review it in advance of the next report, and it will probably be done a bit sooner than it would usually be timetabled for. Finally, in terms of risk updates, the 2 additional risks that have been included, these 2 new risks are risk CR18, which is failure in customer interface. This has now been included on the risk register, and a new risk CR19, which is failure to determine planning applications within statutory timescales or within agreed extensions of time. So those are 2 news that we have added during this quarter. In addition to those points, I'd like to draw members' attention to paragraph 16. The risk team is continually horizon scanning to identify new issues and link with officers to give them early insight into any changing environments and the need for them to consider emerging issues. We use these also to inform risk challenges, both at a corporate and a service level. In general terms, the risk register provides a strong analysis of risk, but the council needs to continue to be alert and update, mitigate and escalate risks as they occur both singly and concurrently, as we have continued to do throughout the pandemic. Thank you for the opportunity to present this report. I'm happy to assist where I can with any questions or the more particular 2 new risks.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Manton. Before we just get to questions, and the 2 risks that you have identified, I just thought I'd recapture this for members of the committee who perhaps are new or weren't aware of this from previous meetings. We've had some considerable concerns in terms of the elevation of these 2 later items onto the corporate risk register. I've listened to members of the committee about this, and customer services and the planning service are the 2 that you have now introduced. And I think that these are at CR18 and CR19, and we've got the respective senior officers here with us this evening online in order to first of all introduce those two risks and the current situation, but then to hold it open to members for questions. Of course, you may have questions on other items, but I wanted us just to focus on those 2 in particular. But what I would like to stress is that we will need these to come back to a longer session, probably in a future meeting. So don't feel that we have to explore every aspect of this evening. That is not the intention. It's to deal with it in the way that we would normally deal with the corporate risk register and particular issues to be highlighted this evening. And then we will come back and deal with them in greater depth, because I know there is widespread concern about these 2 areas, not just actually by members of this committee, but across the council, and indeed across a number of people outside of the council. And then the other aspect which I wanted to bring in and introduce onto the risk register is one about the climate change delivery strategy and the position that we find ourselves in on that. Once it's on the register, then we'll get regular quarterly updates on those issues, which I think is something that should be occurring. And so I think, Ms Manton, unless the committee don't agree with me, that we would like to see that introduced, presumably as risk CR20 for the next corporate risk register and ongoing. And if that could be done, I think that would be very useful in order to be able to gauge the progress that the council's making and where those risks are and how they're being addressed. I don't want to take it any wider than that, because our remit is clear. This is the Audit and Governance Committee and we mustn't exceed that remit, but I do believe it's legitimate for us to have those risks identified on the corporate risk register for the future. Are members in general agreement that we should do that? Thank you, and I'd ask Mr Hanton to introduce that onto the recommendations for this evening, so that we've got it properly minuted for the future. So, questions from members I will deal with in a moment. Could I please ask, therefore, that briefly we get a sort of position statement, if you like, about how particularly the issues are being addressed. Firstly, around customer from Matty Roslett, and secondly, around the planning service from Nick Perrins. So we'll start with you, Mr Roslett, please.
Thanks, Chairman. Good evening, members. The risk, as as defined in the risk register, the new risk, failure in customer interface. Probably important just to say that comprises a number of different ways in which our customers make contact with us. And I think the way that probably is causing most concern at the moment is via the telephone, but we also have customer contact via face-to-face and indeed online. But recognising that in particular it's customer contact that is causing concerns amongst members, we have already, I think, kind of identified that the complexity in the way that people contact us via the telephone is something that needs to be resolved. We have a huge amount of contact. A significant amount of that contact arrives to us via the corporate customer contact centre, and a significant amount also comes via many of the telephone lines. So it's a hugely complex picture, and as you say, Chair, there's probably a further opportunity to get into the detail of this in due course. But for the moment, recognising that there are concerns around our ability to respond to that customer contact, in particular that telephone contact, we are currently trying to establish a clearer picture of our performance data. And the reason it's complicated is that, as I say, there's lots of calls coming in lots of different ways, not all through the corporate customer contact centre, and the way in which we define that data in terms of what a good call should look like and what a failed call should look like is not necessarily straightforward. So there's lots of ways we can kind of slice and dice the information, and we're currently working on that at the moment. What I would probably just say that the future of our customer contact and hopefully the future success of our customer contact will come about as a result of the transformation of the organisation, and therefore the reduction in customer contact, because most people will be able to access the information they need more easily than calling us, and that leaves us with the ability to look after those that need our face-to-face and our telephone contact more successfully. So reducing the overall contact, but looking after our customers more, and automating where possible parts of our functions. But in the short term, and recognising that current performance is not satisfactory, we're looking at a number of ways in which we can improve the situation. One of those is to put more staff into the customer contact centre to take more calls, as well as improve some of the technology that exists in the contact centre, specifically the number of channels through which calls can come into the contact centre, because we have a limitation currently on how many that are available, and once we exceed that number, there is a potential for calls to drop out, and that's clearly not what we want. So there's a couple of more immediate tactical approaches that we'll be taking, but I would draw members' attention to that kind of longer term vision, which ultimately would ensure that customers get the responses they need via a number of different ways that work for them, and that customer contact via the telephone should be less popular, less required than it currently is at the moment, but that's kind of work in progress. So the baseline data is what we're currently working on, and as it says in the report, that we'll be able to provide the committee with a clearer picture of that in due course. But I'm happy to take questions, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Rashford. We'll come to those in a moment. And the second officer we have online is Mr. Perrins, the head of planning, and perhaps, Mr. Perrins, you could say a few words about risk CR19 and what the current position is. Mr. Perrins.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, committee. Yes, so planning applications, as you were probably all aware, the government sets statutory timeframes for the processing of planning applications, and it's very important for communities, businesses, the council, everyone involved in the planning process, for planning applications to be processed in a timely way against those statutory timescales or within agreed extensions of time. And the big issue, or the key issue at the moment, is due to the volume of work in the system, the planning service is having issues with processing planning applications within the timescales everybody wants. So the effect of that, we're not really close to government intervention levels, because the government do set sort of minimum thresholds you have to hit. We're quite well above those, but it's the wider issues around the council's reputation, how the customers engage with the service, and it creates a whole system of complaints and essentially delay. And obviously, we're delaying people getting on with their building projects and so forth. So it's a very serious issue. So therefore, it's right to raise the risk. It's been something which obviously we've known about for some time, and there's been quite a lot of work been going in to try and address the issue. So there's sort of various mitigations already set up with the Planning Improvement Board, which meets monthly. We have recruitment programs in place. We're looking at the processes. That's a key part of our of the issues in the service, is actually bringing the process together to go away from the 3 legacy systems into one. So all of that is being looked at and in place. So the measures are there. There's a change plan in place, and that it's now a case of making sure we implement those changes as soon as we can, and bring essentially the service back into what we'd all like to be a good time in terms of processing applications.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perrins. I thought, members, that would be helpful just to get those 2 updates. So in looking at the paper generally across the whole of the corporate risk register, members, you've got questions. Councillor Phipps.
Yes, just a question about, well, it's to do with CR18 really. On page 109, paragraph 11, CR18, it says it's a new risk, and it's going to show, it shows to be determined and will remain as such until the analysis is complete and actions and interventions agreed. Whereas on CR19, it says there's going to be a report coming back to the committee. Well, I am aware from, we had a transformation seminar, which Matty was at, obviously, because he was part of it. And we were told that the changes that they're trying to put in place to do with the customer interface, all of it, will take a while. Could take a year, it could take longer. And I do think that in the interim, we should be getting something coming back. We can't leave this to be determined forever until such time as it says analysis is complete and actions and interventions agreed. And I just wondered how we're going to monitor it if nothing is coming back, or can we have something that comes back, as we are with the planning one, the reports coming back.
So my anticipation, before I go to Mr. Rashford, is that that further action column in respect of CR18 will be changed the next time it comes back to us. And that would be my expectation, is what I said, to be defined. By then it will have been defined and we will have moved on. Mr. Rashford, could you confirm that that is likely to be the case, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Councillor Phipps refers both to the longer term vision, which indeed will take time to deliver. There's a lot of work got to go into the technology and the capabilities that will enable us to improve our overall customer experience in the longer term. But I also refer to some of the more tactical responses to the issues we're experiencing at the moment, which are kind of centre around increased demand, more complexity in what we're dealing with when we take calls and so on. So there are a number of options we're currently trying to explore, potentially around more staff. That's not a longer term requirement, that'd be a shorter term requirement to increase our capacity to deal with those calls whilst we develop those longer term aspirations. So most definitely we'll be in a position to report back soon on what our approach should be, and also to present to the committee what our dashboard of performance will be. As I say, it's not simply a case of calls coming in and answer calls. There's a lot of complexity around how calls are routed, forwarded on, call handling, kind of queuing systems and all sorts of things. So we're trying to identify what we think is a useful, fair kind of reflection of what performance data we should be capturing and using to drive forward performance. We're doing that right now. So most definitely we'll be able to return to this meeting soon with an update on the progress that we're making.
And could I just perhaps add to my expectations for this next quarterly report, in so much as all of that is well and good and we all wish it well and we hope that it can be accelerated, I know that. But the other concern that I have, and I'm sure it's shared also, is the infrastructure that lies beneath that. In other words, it's all very well and good getting the customer contact side of it right, but with all the delays that have occurred to date, we need to make sure that the council is in a position to deliver on those customer calls and those customer communications, not just in a timely way, but in an effective way. And therefore, it's a bit wider than just customer. And I think we need that to be reported on within this risk. But we also, outside of this meeting, need to be assured that the council's capability to deliver in the way I've just described is actually set up and ready to run, and won't then disappoint those residents and others who use the contact centre. They will see delivery as a result of their calls. So I didn't want to open that up as a debating issue, but that is my expectation for the next quarterly report and the work that perhaps could be reported on in the interim as a result of my other remarks. So if that could be noted, please, it would be appreciated. Councillor Phipps, did you want to come back on your question, or are you
No, as
satisfied?
long as we're getting a report back, that's fine by me.
Excellent, thank you. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's on the same point, actually, CR18, about failure in customer interface risk. And to sort of reiterate the concerns that Councillor Phipps has made, really, this is something I've raised concerns at a previous Audit Governance Committee, and I know the Chair has as well, which is why we're here and we've got this risk here. What's been said about, obviously transformation and things will happen in time, sort of assumes that the systems we got are working adequately in place, and in my experience, they're just not. I'll give you a brief experience from this week. I tried to report a pothole as a ward councillor, something I've done before, hasn't been problematic. The systems just don't work, online or over the telephone. I tried to do it online, using my council laptop on the council system, as is recommended, nice, quick and easy. The data displayed on the system is just totally erroneous. All the potholes in my ward were given addresses in Christchurch and Poole Town Centre, completely erroneous information. So I couldn't look to get an update on a pothole in my ward. So I tried to report a pothole. It doesn't allow you to tag the location. So ultimately, I thought, well, I'm going to have to phone. So it gave me a phone number to phone, 01202 261 700, the old Borough of Poole environment number. You phone that number. It says this number is no longer in use by the council. Please call 123 123. So why is the system telling customers to call a phone number the council no longer uses? I call 123 123, press the buttons to get through to report potholes. Get through to a very helpful customer advisor after quite a lengthy wait. Give her the code number for the report that I wanted an update on this pothole report. Oh, never heard of that code number. The system doesn't recognise. They put into the system, the customer contact system doesn't recognise the reference number that's given on the screen on the online report it service. And then she said, oh, that's a highways issue. We don't deal with highways. You need to call 123 123 and press the buttons to report a pothole. I pointed out that's exactly what I'd done and got through to her. Oh, well, we don't deal with highways. I'll have to speak to a supervisor. It's just not working. In that experience, the customer interface has failed already. I could not report a pothole online or on the phone. I could not get an update on a pothole report online or on the phone as a ward councillor. And so I just couldn't do it. So I'm left. I can't update a resident about what's happening with a pothole. I couldn't report it in myself. The customer interface has failed. It needs to be addressed now, not as part of a transformation programme over the next year or two. We need to deal with the issues the system's got now.
So, Mr. Rassett, without getting too detailed into a specific issue, I think that is a good example of the frustration which I have personal experience of being able to express as well. And I think it's getting into those issues in a practical sense. If that's frustrating for a councillor, it must be even more so for a resident who doesn't use our systems very frequently. I don't know whether you need to comment, really. I'm sure the point is made. I have others who want to ask questions, so my suggestion is that they may not be questions about this particular item, but I will ask you to wrap up at the end, if that would be the will of the committee. Councillor Rice.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the fact that the climate change was going to be added as a risk. So that's really good. I just wanted to understand how things are added onto this. I suppose one of the other issues that sprung to mind looking at this report is road safety. And through my own research, I'm very concerned about road safety in our particular area because we are regularly in the worst 10 out of 121 local authorities in terms of injuries to people walking and cycling. And obviously we have as a council, we design and manage the roads and directly manage risk to individuals. So obviously I have that knowledge, so I'd be perfectly comfortable with putting that onto a corporate risk register. But maybe everybody else in the committee wouldn't be so comfortable putting it on there. So I was just wondering what the process would be to raise it to the committee.
Well, thank you for that, Councillor Rice. I can answer part of it, and then I'll pass over to Ms Manton. And I'll answer it in this sense that I did write to all members of the committee, as I have done on previous occasions, and I wrote to everybody, was it in late December? Yes, just before Christmas, with suggestions of what you might want to see considered to come forward onto our forward plan. And I didn't receive, apart from Councillor Phipps, I don't think I received any responses, but I had, and the Vice Chairman did one which I think we've now resolved for the time being. I had 5 myself, of which one was to add climate change delivery to the corporate risk register. Okay, so that's why it's up in front of us this evening. That's the process to go through. It means that we're not sort of deciding things in committee on the hoof, so to speak, that I have time to make sure that officers are comfortable, or is there a better way of doing it, and so on. We can take that one forward, and thank you very much for the suggestion, but I would like to try and keep it contained to the process that I've set up already for the committee, if I can. I wonder, Ms Manton, would you like to answer that specific issue and suggestion from Councillor Rice, please?
Certainly, thank you, Chair. In terms of how risks are included on the corporate risk register, we routinely have meetings. I meet with the Chief Executive Officer every 6 weeks, and obviously I'm continually horizon scanning for new risks. We have a discussion around emerging issues, any matters that we think should be considered as corporate risks. Suggestions are then fed out to other corporate directors, and a discussion is had as to whether something is to come forward as a corporate risk or not. So that's how they come from the officer, if you like, perspective. They're from informed discussions, and also we do give consideration to service level risks as well. So they're considered as to whether they should be escalated to a corporate level, what service risks exist in the organisation, etc. And then obviously more recently, members of this committee have put forward requests for corporate risks to be considered, and today's request will be reviewed and will be considered for the next report to this committee.
Thank you very much, and so we'll hear about it in due course. That's appreciated. Thank you. Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Chairman. It's just to go back to the customer service element that David was mentioning, just regarding the websites, that they all look the same. So the elements of reporting it and accessing the information and the data that we have, and the customer element side is easy to access, because I know we are quite frustrated. Our residents are frustrated. Trying to find something on the website can be quite difficult. It's an element. So just a note there. That's all. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Butt. I'll ask Mr Raslet to mop up with that one as well presently. Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. I will try and be brief. Yes, just following on very quickly. I'm not going to rehash anything. I think we're all on the same page with CR18 and where we'd like to see it. It was just a little cheeky plea to, when we do actually get more evidence coming forward, if we could see, as the Chair said, not just the kind of call data and the handling of it, but everything below. and if we could actually have that prior to A&G in maybe even a bit more timely manner, that'd be great, just so we can brief ourselves through that. Secondly, just going back up to page 109, I see we have, sorry, let me a sec. We'll be able to get more of an accurate reading with a new risk management framework. And will we be able to have a better look at the data and the risk? And also, how much when will that go live? Because I see that it seems to be round the corner, but I don't know how, until you're comfortable to let it go live, because I understand using the former Bournemouth Council's model might be a bit different in the sense of how we are now as BCP. So updating that risk management framework is obviously a great thing. It's just, when are we going to land it, and what changes will we see in that sense? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Fear. I wonder whether, Ms Menton, would you like to take that second point, and then I'll use the other one in the mop-up later on.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. In relation to the risk management framework, we are currently working on it. Any risk management framework is challenging in terms of developing it and getting it right for a new organisation. We've been very fortunate. We've had the ability to use the Bournemouth model, which was very similar to the Poole and the Christchurch model. So in that respect, I think what we do need to reflect on, and we have been greatly reflecting on, is taking account of the change in the organisation in terms of the definitions we use. That they do need to be different to the Bournemouth version that's currently in use, and that's what we're working on at the moment. So we hope to have a version very soon to bring to this committee as a draft.
Thank you very much. Is that all right, Councillor Fear? You? Thank you. And I have a question, I think, from Councillor Cox, who is online. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is really to do with the overall risk system, management system, rather than anything specific. Because I fear that, or certainly my understanding of a risk register, is to highlight where service may fail. And yet today we've got two services effectively added to the risk register that have already failed. And therefore it seems to me that the risk register itself is failing because it's not doing what it's supposed to do. And that is to highlight what might fail. Now, I'm delighted that you've added the climate change. I think that's a very wise move, because it is clearly something that we should keep an eye on. So I hear what Fiona's saying about changes to it, but I think that perhaps the changes may need to be a bit more fundamental than maybe tinkering around with what Bournemouth did previously, because it seems to me what was done previously is not working. One area that I would have thought we should be looking at and adding is to do with the housing department and health and safety. Given the recent report that we've had 700 plus failures of health and safety to do with our housing department, and that seems to me quite, and I appreciate it's a historic thing, but it's something that we should be looking at and putting on a register. But we should be looking at a risk register for something that might fail, that is at risk of failure. And what we've done today is to highlight things that actually, as you quite rightly pointed out, that many people have been saying this is failing, and yet we've only put it on there now that it's failed. That was the comment I was meant to make.
Well, thank you for those comments, Councillor Cox. From my own experience, and I dare say this is reflected in other former councils, my own experience in Bournemouth was that actually we did manage to get to these issues before the word failure could be attached to them. And so therefore the corporate risk register was working in the way that you've just set out. But I do understand and appreciate the point you're making. And I know that these two new additions around customer interface and the planning service are only there as a result of pressure from this committee. and I accept that that isn't the right way round. Therefore, it seems to me that review along the lines you've suggested is necessary. I don't want to prolong this unnecessarily, but I think the Chief Executive is on the line, and we've heard that Ms Manton reports on a regular basis to the Chief Executive. And I wondered, Mr Farrant, if you are with us online, could you perhaps respond to the points made by Councillor Cox, and could you share with us your vision of the way forward for this, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. In fact, I was just in the process of putting my hand up to respond to that point when you brought me in, so thank you for that. I think the part of the comment that I would make is that we do have some detailed service risk registers as well. And I have to say, things like the housing issue would normally feature on the service risk register. So I wouldn't want the committee to think that the corporate risk register is the only way that we have of managing risk and of monitoring it. As you said, I think that housing issue actually was a long-standing systems issue, which had failed to notify of a lack of inspections of some properties, which we've now picked up. We have reported that to the housing central registration in the government department, and I think housing regulator, sorry. And that is an unusual step, but is one that we felt we should take because of the scale of the issue that had been missed due to the system. But actually, that would normally be a service-based risk issue and not a corporate one. These two issues that are coming up, I think the customer services one I can see is a genuine issue at the moment, that we have increased demand, we have reduced resources, and we have systems that are beyond the end of their shelf life. I think we're putting them together into a new system, and I would hope that this is a 12-month or so issue that we need to deal with. I have to say I wouldn't see it as being a long-standing item for the corporate risk register. Similarly with planning, I think the reason that we have planning potentially coming onto the corporate risk register is because of the scale of the issue that a planning service which isn't delivering on behalf of the residents and businesses would have in terms of economic impact, the big plan vision, the view that we have, and the local plan that's being developed at the moment. So I think these two are fairly unique at time and at the scale that they are. We do have effective risk registers at the service levels, and Fiona Manton picks those up and ensures that those are in place. Then we try and bring the corporate risks into this corporate risk register. One of the differences between local government and most private companies, I think, is the breadth of services that we provide. So we are trying to just look at those things that affect the corporate whole and not the individual services. The individual service risks, as I say, are managed within each service directorate. I don't know if that's helpful, Jim, but I hope that might put a bit of context around the scale. I don't know whether Fiona would want to comment on the quality and calibre of the individual directorate or service risk registers at all.
Thank you. That's very helpful, Mr. Farrant. Ms. Manton, did you want to come back in that way?
Only to say, obviously, as a continually changing organisation, we've been working with services to make sure they've got robust risk registers in place, and we will continue to do so. That's part of my team's role to liaise with risk champions that exist in most service areas, and we will continue to ensure that those risk registers develop.
Thank you very much. Did you want to come back, Councillor Cox, or is that sufficient for this evening on this item?
No, thank you. That's sufficient. I just think we need to review the way the risk register is put together, and maybe in terms of the service level, the services risk registers, maybe those need to be reviewed either at different committees or occasionally at this committee. But it did strike me that our risk register, certainly our corporate risk register, was failing if we were suddenly having to put these things on once they've failed. And the idea of a risk register is there to highlight them just before they fail, so that we can do something about it.
No, those points I think are truly noted. I think the officers have taken those on board, and it obviously all channels through to the top, and Mr. Farrant is aware now of really the thinking of the committee, and I'm sure that we'll see some direct action as a result. I did say, Mr. Rassett, that I would come back to you just so that you can give us some final comments on some of the issues that have been raised around customer. Could you just respond, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. If I just touch briefly on Councillor Brown's concerns, clearly his experience was unsatisfactory. I'm not going to try and defend the fact that he's gone through so many hoops to try and get a satisfactory conclusion. And we're definitely, as I've described, trying to identify what both the more shorter term and the longer term solutions to that kind of experience might look like. But it's really important for me to kind of stress that some of the solutions will be that bit longer, because the situation we find ourselves in is complex, and we've inherited complexity. We've got rid of some of that complexity, but it still remains in parts of our business where services are delivered differently across the former legacy areas, or they're backed up by different IT systems, which makes the response to our customer inquiries that bit more challenging. It doesn't mean that we're complacent about that. We don't think there's a problem. There clearly is an issue we need to deal with, but it's really important we highlight what we can do quickly and what will necessarily take that bit longer, so that we're honest and transparent about how quickly we can improve. Secondly, the other issue that was referred to was around websites. Yes, we're still dealing with information to our customers to some extent based on where which legacy area they lived in. We're not necessarily in a place where all services are provided uniquely and as part of a single process across the piece, which means that we still have to hold on to different ways in which people can see and access information. Not satisfactory, something we are gradually chipping away at, but totally understand members' views around wanting it to be better, and we continue to work on that. So grateful for the input. Hopefully in future meetings we can provide greater reassurance. The only other observation I'd make is just the role of audit and governance compared to overview and scrutiny in relation to monitoring performance, as opposed to understanding how we measure performance. But that's perhaps a subject of further conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Rassett. So, members, I've got no more questions that have been posed. I'd like to just go to the recommendation, and then I shall make a quick comment if I can. And the recommendation is that the report is for noting. However, we all know that we're a little bit deeper than just noting it, and we've added, I think, to it and to its remit. So if the committee are content to note, I'd just like to deal with that first. Do we note that? Thank you. Ms. Manton, and through you to the Chief Executive, and secondly, back through to the two new corporate risks, Mr. Raslett and Mr. Perrins being the heads of those services. This is very much in our focus at the moment. I won't repeat all the comments that have been made, but we are expecting to move forward on not only on the individual issues within the corporate risk register, but to the formatting and the thinking that go with it. And I hope that that can be a substantial part of the next quarterly report that you prepare, Ms. Manton, for the committee, because I think that's what we'll be looking for. So we'll be looking at the individual risks. Yes, certainly we will, but the strategic approach across the corporate risk register, we will also be expecting to see in the way that's been discussed this evening. And I hope that the notes from this meeting that Mr. Hanson is recording can reflect that in some way, so that we've got a marker in the sand over it, and hopefully move on to deal with these issues in the way I've described. If I could say thank you very much indeed for your report, Ms. Manton.
Do we want to add in the extra corporate risk that you mentioned earlier as well, that climate change?
Indeed, I thought I'd said that at the time, but certainly members agreed it at the time. But as a recommendation out of this meeting, if that could be recorded accordingly, Mr. Hampton, thank you very much indeed, and we'll we'll give consideration in the way that we discussed earlier around the road safety issue, and I'll wait for Ms Manton to come back on that when it's being considered. So thank you very much for that, Ms Manton. Thank you, Mr Rowslet. And thank you, Mr Perrin. So you got away lightly this evening, but don't take that as being read for the future. That may well be more in the focus depending on performance coming out of the measures that you've been putting in place. But thank you all very much indeed for your attendance this evening.
Thank you.
So, members, we are somewhat behind time because we've had very important and meaningful discussions over some of the other issues. I would like, if we can, to speed up a little bit with the other items that we have this evening. So without further ado, can we move on to item 9 on the agenda, which is the Annual Governance Statement 2020-21 Action Plan Update. And I'll ask Mr Stannard, Head of Audit and Management Assurance, to introduce the report. I may need to go back to the Chief Executive about one of the items at the appropriate time. Mr Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. With your last comments on board, I'll try and tailor what I was going to say to be brief to give you the opportunity to ask the questions you might want to ask. So bear with me on that. So you may recall that we identified 2 significant governance improvement areas in last year's annual governance statement, and this report provides an update on the agreed actions that we said we would make to those respective areas, them being governance of children's services and governance arrangements with external bodies respectively. So just in terms of the explanation of the table in the report, the shaded area at the top of each element is the text used in last year's annual governance statement, how we articulated what our issues were, and you agreed that annual governance statement back in July. So the updates shown in this report can really be summarised that we're making good progress in both areas, but there's still work to do. I'll give you an example. So in the second of the 2 governance issues, in terms of developing corporate partnership oversight, we're a little bit behind the targets we set ourselves for having things like the register and the guidance in place. But you'll see at point B on page 133 that the recent peer challenge that we've had has seemed to be very positive about the council, what the council has achieved and what we've planned. So finally, in terms of how this may articulate through to the annual governance statement this year, and without prejudicing any of the work and evidence gathering we'll be doing shortly, it does feel that both issues will feature again, albeit there may be a narrowing or focusing the definition slightly. But that's my professional judgment at this stage, and I'll leave it there and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Stannard. I just wondered, Chief Executive, whether you could give us some words and some guidance about the governance of Children's Social Services in your role as Chair of the Children's Service Improvement Board. Mr Farrant?
Certainly, Chairman. Actually, the Improvement Board itself that we have is chaired by Anthony Douglas, who is the DfE advisor appointed to support BCP Council through its improvement programme. So we have independent chair, we have input there from the Department for Education and from the Local Government Association at regional level, and a member attendance of the portfolio holders, the leader, and then myself, Director of Children's Services, and other directors that are required. So, for example, Director of Transformation, Julian Oscar Forbes, attended to talk about transformation within Children's Services. So we have a strong improvement board that meets regularly. Anthony Douglas, the DfE advisor, reports directly to the DfE, to the Minister from those meetings. So effectively our time to fit with his reporting cycle. And we also have a separate board looking at the high needs block as well. So we're looking at maintaining as much corporate oversight. One of the things that I've been really strong at advocating is that Children's Services is a corporate function where the council will deliver services to young people across the BCP area. It is not a function that is entirely run by the Director of Children's Services and the Children's Services Directorate. And I want to be really clear about that, because the HR support, for example, comes from corporate HR, legal support comes from corporate legal, financial support from finance. So this is a whole council approach to improving our children's services. And that's where we need to be positioned if we're going to make the significant improvements that we want to make to children's services across all three, the area of all three preceding councils. We are also looking at a very strong IT support. So that corporate governance is I think, robust. The challenge for us all is making the improvements as fast as we want to, as deeply as we want to, in the current environment in which the pandemic has distracted many people, has caused much concern to local people, and has had a real impact both on the delivery of services, but also on the speed at which we can manage the change within those services. So I hope that's helpful, but happy to expand on that if you would want me to.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you, Chief Executive. And I hope that our minutes can reflect those words that you gave us a moment ago about the corporate approach for improvements to children's services in terms of corporate governance. This is a whole council issue and a hugely important one, and one I think which this committee attaches the right and appropriate degree of importance. And indeed, in terms of the risk element that you passingly referred to, the high needs budget is one which is of huge concern also, and we appreciate the work that's going on in trying to resolve that issue. I suspect we'll hear a little bit more about that in the budget and the budget statement itself, and the work that's being undertaken to try and cap that and pull it back. So thank you for that. Members, do you have questions on any of the issues, obviously, within this report, but most specifically around the children's element of the Chief Executive? I haven't had any questions indicated, so if I may, I will go. Sorry, slight delay. I've got an IT issue. I won't be a moment. Thank you. My apologies, members. I will resolve my IT issue before I get to the next item, but if I could then go to the recommendation, which I'll read out, hence the delay. And the recommendation is that Audit and Governance Committee note the progress made to address the significant governance issues on the BCP Council AGS Action Plan 2020-21 and the actions required to ensure full compliance with the Financial Management Code. Can we agree that? I'll do that on a show of hands, I think. All those in agreement? Yes. Thank you very much indeed, members. That's appreciated. And again, apologies for the very slight delay in that item. Takes us on to item 10 on the agenda, which is the assurance framework and internal audit planning consultation. And I think Mr. Stannard, as Head of Audit and Management Assurance, you're going to introduce the report. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you again, Chair. So the public sector internal audit standards requires the relevant board or committee to approve a risk-based audit plan and an audit charter on an annual basis. You are the relevant committee for BCP, and you will do this in April, at your April meeting in a couple of months' time. As a precursor to that meeting, it's best practice for you to be consulted on the high-level approach that we propose and the framework within which we work. So I'll be able to take into account any comments you have this evening and incorporate them into the plan and the charter respectively. If we first turn our attention to the assurance framework, which is in practice a very high level and crude map, it's shown at Appendix A of this report, and this identifies the significant sources of assurance the Council has in place that internal audit will consider and how we consider to determine the adequacy of our systems, controls and our operational arrangements, ultimately, of course, to assure ourselves and give ourselves the best possible chance of meeting our stated objectives and outcomes as a council. You'll see within that we've added the line sustainable environment. Based on other things we've heard this evening, that might not be the best language, but I think you can appreciate that we're trying to incorporate our climate objectives within the work we do, and we're incorporating it proposed into a key assurance function. That being similar to a health and safety, for example, where it's cross-cutting across all services and everything we do. So in simple terms, the assurance framework is the skeleton in which we hang the detailed audit plan off. Turning to the high-level resource allocation on page 140 and 141 of our packs, one of my responsibilities is to assure you and the Chief Finance Officer that the resource available for internal audit is sufficient and adequate for me to be able to give you an overall opinion based on all the work we've done at year end. At this stage, of course, the 22-23 budget is not approved. So this document assumes that the Internal Audit Service will receive broadly the same allocation in budget terms adjusted for inflation as it has this year. And if that is the case, I can give you assurance that this is adequate resource to undertake all the functions you expect. The resource allocation does have very little wriggle room, however, but in the current climate, I think you'll agree that that's exactly how things should be, and we cannot build in significant amounts of contingency contingency, because ultimately that's funded by the taxpayer. At this stage, Chair, happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stannard. So, members, just to recap, this report is around the methodology and the process approach that Mr. Stannard has undertaken, and includes sustainability and the assurance that the Council will meet its sustainability targets. And as Mr. Stannard said, that is in a way interdependent with the other work that we've asked to be undertaken around the risk register as well. So members, do you have any questions of Mr. Stannard on this item? Councillor Phipps.
Sorry, didn't turn it on, did I? I thought I had. On this final page, the assurance framework, April 2022, the bottom one is the peer reviews, corporate peer challenge. Is that the peer challenge that has been going on within the council recently, or is this something more internal?
Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Councillor. Peer reviews happen across the council in a variety of ways. Indeed, we have actually had a corporate peer review recently, and I think that the outcomes of that are going to be reported fairly soon. But we do have other peer reviews in certain service areas periodically. So we're just trying to give examples of other assurance areas that we take into account in our work. So, for example, if let me just see if I can. Planning may have a peer review from time to time, and that would be taken into account in terms of the overall opinion of that peer review in the work and the aggregation of all that, bringing it back to this committee through the Chief Internal Auditor's annual opinion at year end.
Okay, so it's an internal thing. Yeah, I've got that now. Thank you.
As well as the external peer challenge, or as well as the external peer challenge, which was arranged with the LGA only recently. And which
Yeah, that was the one I was
on.
pretty much referring to. And so something will come back to this committee on that then? Is that what you're saying here?
I think that'll be coming back to the council, actually.
It won't come to this committee first. I'm just saying, because it's on there, that's all. Where does it go? That
Mr. Stannard, could you?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think I misunderstood the question, actually. So peer challenges are usually exclusively external. So another planning service would come and do a peer challenge on our planning service, for example. But in terms of your question about the specific corporate peer challenge, I think Councillor Beasley is correct that would be reported to Cabinet initially and then full Council.
That isn't to say that if there are issues in there which should rightly be taken up by Audit and Governance that we wouldn't do so, but we have to wait seeing the results of the challenge and for it to go through that corporate process first, I think. Nobody else has indicated, but I just wanted to press the point that you've already raised, Mr. Stannard, because I'd have raised it anyway, and that is around the forthcoming budget and the element of there being sufficient resources for you to undertake a satisfactory level of work on these issues. I think you've confirmed to the committee that that is the case, because if it were not the case, then obviously I would need to be taking that up appropriately. But I think for the time being, you are satisfied.
I am satisfied, Chair, and I have very clear statutory requirement to make my views clear to the Chief Executive and the Chief Finance Officer if there is inadequate internal audit resource, but that isn't the position at the moment. Thank you.
No, I'm pleased to hear that. Thank you very much. So, members, can I take us to the recommendations? There are two of them. The first is to agree the BCP assurance framework. Can we agree that, please? Thank you. And the second is to provide any comments or feedback on the proposed draft 2022-23 internal audit plan, high-level allocation of resource and delivery approach. We've given some comment and feedback. Obviously, if members have got anything further outside after this meeting, then please feed them through to me, and I, in turn, I will take them through to Mr. Stannard. Thank you very much. So that would be helpful in terms of making sure that we've got follow through from what we're doing this evening. Takes us on to item 11 on the agenda, which is the internal audit quarterly audit plan update. And again, it's Mr. Stannard as Head of Audit and Management Assurance. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you again, Chair. So this report, I'm sure you're fairly familiar with these days. It's received at every committee cycle. It's just an update of the work that internal audit have conducted since our last reporting cycle. So very quickly moving to page 146 and the table in paragraph 3, just pick out a couple of issues in there for you, if I may. So line 3, environment, parks, governance arrangements. You'll recall at our meeting in December, it was alluded to that we were close to finishing. We were likely to issue a partial audit opinion. That is the case. This little asterisk in the table implies at the time of writing we hadn't actually finalised all that with management. In the last week we have, so management have agreed with all those recommendations and they'll be implemented. The Section 4 of the report does actually go into some of those recommendations out of that parks governance in more detail for you as per our charter, and you can see those. They won't be surprises, a lot of those issues for you, because you will have heard them and seen them in the presentations through the last year, but the audit does clarify them and agree a programme for improvement. So bear with me, I'm having the same issues as the chairman had earlier with IT. So line 5, development discretionary grants. We will hear at our next agenda item, the forward plan, that we are to look at a specific area of discretionary grants in a meeting in February. This was the wider discretionary COVID grants system, and we've concluded that the arrangements are reasonable in that area. Moving on through the report, you can see in the second table on page 148 that we've got a lot of audit work progressing at the moment, which is all good. No issues, no worries from my perspective in terms of things like limitation of scope coming into the equation at year end through the fact of not done enough audit work to give an overall opinion. So you can see the progression on those accordingly. We've also implemented 4 more either recommendations or suggestions out of the PS and the PSIAS and SIP for review, and they're shown in the table at paragraph 8. Finally, I do just want to say that we have had 2 audit managers hand their notice in recently. One has moved to a job in accountancy, so they've been retained in BCP Council, and one has left for a career development in another entity. So, you know, that's not always a bad thing to have rotation, and it shows that we are developing our staff nicely. So, c'est la vie on that, I think. The market is problematic in terms of recruiting. At the moment, I'm covering those hours through talking nicely to a couple of managers that work part-time. That may not be sustainable long-term, but it is filling a gap whilst we recruit. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. Members, any questions? Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just looking on page 147, which is the Environment Parks Partnership Governance, bullet point 3, about occupancy of council land and buildings by a third party without appropriate legal agreements in place, and that it's not limited to parks. So clearly there are other service units where this problem exists, and I certainly have issues with our community centre, for instance, and how it's run, and whether the requirements within the lease are regularly checked. And in fact, I'm not even sure that the new council has any access to the leases that exist. So I would like a little bit more, it's marked as high priority, so I would like a little bit more understanding of this particular issue, and not so much how it relates to the park. So I think I can understand there, but to which other sort of service units might be involved, and what it means for them and for us as a committee in terms of perhaps looking at some of the what obviously are governance arrangements for potentially external bodies using our assets.
I think we touched on this at a previous meeting, might even have been the last quarterly meeting, but Mr. Stannard, could you comment on Councillor Brooks' question, please?
Yeah, Councillor Brooks is right in everything he says. In terms of what we're trying to do about it, The corporate landlord model that we're talking about in terms of transformation will go some way towards, bringing the information together. A lot of it's information that you'd expect to be held corporately, but is sort of spread around the organisation at the moment. So it may be a case of just bringing information together, but at the moment we have to assume that information isn't there. It may reveal itself through various activities associated with bringing the corporate landlord model together. There isn't as yet a schedule of sort of improvement to systematically go through those properties that fall into this category, but it's something that is on my radar to discuss with the relevant officers in estates.
Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you for that. No, I hadn't associated it with totally with the previous 2 meetings ago, because I don't think I attended the last meeting we had, so it would have been at the last quarterly review. And I know Susan Zeiss made reference that she would continue, because I've got an ongoing issue, and at the moment I'm getting no I haven't sent any reminders out, but I am awaiting, and have been waiting for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks for some sort of answer. And I think it's people can't find the legal documents or don't know where to look for them. And this, if we've got this situation existing across a whole series of service units and properties, it really does raise significant issues as to what are we allowing to happen.
Anything else we can do, Mr. Stannard, or any other kind of direction we can ask others to take within BCP Council, do you think?
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, on the specific issue that Councillor Brooke raises, I can, if we can talk offline, Councillor Brooke, I can, look into what the hold-up is on your specific issue. I'm not sure I can add a lot more to, it's almost the statements and comments that have been made rather than, thank you.
No, I understand. I just thought in trying to square off the specific that Councillor Brooke has raised and is obviously frustrated by, but it leads to a much wider problem, a wider issue, which you're obviously aware of because it's on here as a high priority anyway, but the wider issue that Councillor Brooke's referring to, I think you've noted the points. Thank you very much indeed. So no other questions, members, on this item. Can we agree to note, please? Agreed. Thank you very much. Takes us to the final item on the agenda this evening, which is the refresh of the forward plan. And I would ask Mr. Stannard to introduce the report, perhaps touching on the issues that we're now dealing with that Councillor Phipps has raised previously, and I have one further one to add once you've done that introduction. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. So let's do the positive things first. So in terms of the appendix, you will see that at our next meeting that's shown on this appendix, which is the 17th of March, we have the issue raised by Councillor Phipps in the email to you, Chairman, just before Christmas, which is the tendering and use of consultants. So that's on the forward plan. If I could then draw your attention to paragraph 5, we, in the last couple of weeks or so, the date for the additional restriction grant session has been set, 3rd of February. At the time of going to press, I couldn't put it on the appendix because we didn't have it. In hindsight, maybe putting a column in with a to be identified date might have been a better presentation than putting it in the paragraph, but c'est la vie. And a couple of other areas to consider perhaps tonight. Obviously at council on Tuesday, there may be a need for a discussion on the remaining constitutional elements that the committee's got to somehow factor in and how it might do that. So I think you probably need a discussion tonight on how you're going to do that. And I think, Chair, if I'm right, your comment, is to do with the BCP future places, and maybe I'll leave you to discuss that.
I'll deal with that at the moment, yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. So there are a couple of other things to add in, but I think, Councillor Phipps, we've covered the ones that you've raised. We're trying to get them in as quickly as we can, but obviously there's a resource issue and lots of other pressing business. Could I just deal with the additional one that I'm trying to see if we can slot in, because I think there's a need for it, and it's a relatively urgent one. And it perhaps comes in one part to us and another part more generally. So I think we should have an item to consider around the governance arrangements for the Council's Future Places Company. I think it's something that this committee necessarily should be looking at, but tightly bound into the governance arrangements. And the reason for that is because I don't know what they are. And if I don't, I would suggest nobody else on the committee does, and it's our duty, not just our responsibility, but our duty to do that. So I'm going to ask Mr. Stannard to try and make sure that we can slot that into the forward plan in a timely way. And our suggestion aligned to that, which might be via an informative note, perhaps to the appropriate officer or committee, is that an all-member seminar on the Future Places Company would be advantageous as well, because I think all members need to have a proper understanding rather than just a superficial one gleaned from council reports. And in such a circumstance, there is then the opportunity of an informal question and answer session as well, so that we can get all the issues out that are concerning members and find out what lies behind the skin in terms of operation and so forth. So with your consent, that's what I'm proposing we should do on that. And then the second issue that Mr. Stannard has raised is out of council last Tuesday concerning, if you like, a broader review of overview and scrutiny so that we deal with all of those issues at the same time. I spoke on this in council obviously on Tuesday, so I don't want to rehearse any of that again, but we do need to deal with this in terms of our forward plan. But having said that, I've made it clear to anybody who wants to listen that the responsibility isn't just down to this committee. What I don't want to happen is that we go through the kind of usual process and actually we make a recommendation that then becomes hugely contentious at council. What I would like to do is for audit and governance to look at whatever is coming forward as a proposal, to get the proper input of all the interested parties through audit and governance. We will, on this occasion, and I've discussed this with the Vice Chairman, on this occasion, we will circumvent the Audit and Governance Constitutional Review Committee because we haven't got time to do it in two phases, and therefore we'll deal with it at the main committee on its own. But I'm awaiting input from all the relevant and interested parties. How that will work out, I'm not entirely clear because I've only had since Tuesday night to think about it. But we did have it as an item to follow through on with regard to other aspects of overview and scrutiny in any case. So I want to wrap the whole thing up together. And what I don't want is for this committee to be left on its own to deal with potentially an issue which it can't possibly in the timescale get a proper feel on in terms of everybody's view, and therefore takes forward a proposal via recommendation to full council before the end of the municipal year, because that's what I said I would use best endeavours to do, that can't be sustained when it gets to that full council meeting. And so I'm awaiting information to come back, discussed it with officers, discussed it with the Vice Chairman, and we think that that's probably the best way of confirming that we are using best endeavour, and we will continue to do that. So, Councillor Phipps, you're itching to say something.
Yeah, I mean, last time we actually had a seminar, or you did a all-councillor seminar on everything, and there was full opportunity for anybody to stick their oar in and say they didn't like things or they weren't happy or whatever, and nothing happened. And I think that was pretty shocking what happened at council. I know you went along with it, you know, but I was really surprised. So I mean, what's to say it's not going to happen again? Or are you actually going to get the portfolio holders or whatever? Is that what you're saying? You're actually going to get them involved at the outset within this meeting when we discuss things?
Well, Councillor Phipps, to be clear, I found Tuesday night a little bit frustrating, I have to say, because I and everybody else in this room put a lot of time into constitutional review. I understand all of that. I'm at heart a pragmatist, so we ended up in the position we did out of full council. We can't re-rehearse that, so that's where we are. And I'm just putting down a marker that we're not going to be left to do this on our own and made responsible for it on our own. We have got to have a lot of effort from a lot of other people to get this to a conclusion at whichever council meeting it is, so that it can be enacted for the new municipal year. I think if we're all agreed on one thing, it is that we must get it in a timely way. So that's the frustration that I shared, but I think I've emphasised to one or two people that the work that this committee undertakes through the Audit and Governance Constitutional Review Committee and the main committee is to go through the process that the council has asked us to go through and to come up with recommendations that are well founded out of all the evidence that we've gathered and the discussions that we've had. And I do anticipate out of that, at the very least, that it will be respected to the extent that it will be properly understood that it's been discussed, it's gone through a member seminar, and we're in the position we are before it goes to full council. Clearly that didn't completely succeed, although having said that, it succeeded over most of the changes that we proposed. So we're going to try and do better, but we're going to try and make sure that in doing better, it's the full council that does better rather than specifically this committee. And that's as far as my frustration is going to come out tonight. I won't be drawn further. Councillor Fear.
Thank you, Chair. Just a brief thought. Obviously, members are encouraged and welcome to go along to any committee, even if they don't sit on it, and they can ask questions. Do you think a polite note from you as chairman, with the support of the committee, to all group leaders to attend that particular meeting coming up, and if they're unable to turn up, maybe they could send a representative from their particular group, and also then the unaligned members as well, as a personal invitation, just as a reminder, and also welcome them here to ask any questions. So maybe a polite letter from us would be well welcomed.
I did put out a reminder for the seminar, although some advised me I shouldn't, but I put it out because I wanted to make sure that everybody had been engaged. I think what you're saying is to try to attempt to do that at the appropriate times through group leaders and anybody else who's interested, including the leadership of the council, and that I will do. I will do. I mean, with me, you're pushing at an open door because I want this to be successful. I want us to have done a useful piece of work that is then used by the council productively. I'll do my best. And as I said at council, I will use my best endeavours to do so. I've had some private conversations about it. I will have more about it. And hopefully we can get to that position in time for the new municipal year. Glum faces around the room, but I can't really add to that, can I? Okay, so the forward plan, are there any other issues around what Mr. Stannard set out for us a moment ago, members? Are we happy with that? I think that's a pretty full workload, actually. I think we're at the point now where we don't want to be adding to it. The only thing I would add is that the Constitutional Review Steering Group is collecting other constitutional issues, because there was inevitably a little bit of a lag over from our previous work. I think there are 5 or 6 issues on there, not of huge significance yet. And my intention would be that this would be the last iteration of the life of this council. So it would probably come to us, we think, in the autumn, so that for onward transmission with recommendations to full council, I think we said in November as is a possible date. And if we can do that, then I think we've completed that task within the year in time for it to be operational from the following year. So, members, just moving to the recommendation, are you prepared to approve the forward plan as set out in Appendix A with the amendments that both Mr Stannard and I have spoken to? Can we agree that? Thank you very much indeed. My apologies that this meeting's overrun by half an hour from our usual time. I think it was necessary. Could I thank the officers for their input, both the officers who are in the room and those who've been online? Very much appreciated, thank you. And thank you to members for your input this evening. I think it's been a very productive meeting and I'm grateful for that. And I close the meeting at 20:35. Thank you all very much for attending.